So I want to thank everyone for joining us for Perennial and Frame Picturesque History with the Arkell Museum and Schoharie Crossing. I'm Dave from Schoharie Crossing. You're the audience, and this is what I see as going to be a really fun, fascinating, interesting, and beautiful program featuring some of the amazing images from the collection of the Arkell. And with us, we have Mary Alexander, who is the Curator of Education and Public Engagement at the Arkell Museum at Canajoharie. She received a BA in History and Anthropology from the University of Arizona and obtained a Master's in Museum Studies from the prestigious Cooperstown Graduate Program. Her experience also includes programs and curatorial work at the Farmers Museum and Fenimore Art Museum. So we're extremely lucky to have Mary here with us to go over this beautiful picture history and the images within the permanent collection of the Arkell Museum.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mary Alexander, and I am the Curator of Education and Public Engagement, which I didn't finish on that slide. But as David was saying, this was kind of a fun, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we did this together? And hopefully it will be fun for all of you tuning in from around the country, so feel pretty special about that. To get started, we have David's favorite two people, I think, in the whole entire world. And that is, he may say that's not true, two portraits from the Arkell Museum collection. I should probably rewind a little and say that if you don't know what the Arkell Museum is, we are an art museum in Canajoharie, New York. We also have history of the Mohawk Valley and the Beech Nut Factory. So we have a lot of great fine art, a lot of great advertising art, and a little bit of everything. And I'll tell you about some of my upcoming events at the end of the presentation. So to start with, we have DeWitt Clinton on the left looking awesome and grumpy at the same time, and George Washington on the right. Both of these portraits, we have Ezra Ames, at least attributed to Ezra Ames, for around 1825. So I guess one would say this portrait is kind of after his victory in creating the Erie Canal, if my dates are right in my mind. The other portrait is, of course, of our friend George Washington. This is a Gilbert Stuart portrait. Gilbert Stuart was the man. He was the guy who did the Washington portrait, the one we know of. And I guess as any good artist, one needs to make a little money throughout one's career. So he did make a number of copies of the original portrait, and we have one of those copies. And it is the one that was used to model the $1 bill. In person, this painting just vibrates. His cheeks are rosy. He looks very beautiful and very stately in his garments, which is a little bit of a switch from DeWitt Clinton, whose garments are a bit rougher. But I do like that. I know David does a talk on who wore it best, and not about the outfits that George and DeWitt Clinton are wearing here, but rather how they wore their part in history. But I always enjoy that, you know, George is wearing a little bit nicer an outfit. So I'll throw it over to you, David, if you want to give a little talk on these guys.
Yeah, I think you summarized who wore it better, much better than I ever can, as far as who wore their place in history. And typically when I talk about this portrait of DeWitt Clinton, he's disheveled, he's determined in his brow. He's much more of almost that working man, even though he was upper class when it comes to the way his clothing is represented. And you're right, in 1825, this is circa 1825 that it's attributed to Ezra Ames. He's kind of at his zenith. The canal is opening up. He's governor. He's going to run into a couple more years of issues of governorship and not being governor, and then being kicked off the Canal Commission and then reinstated, and unfortunately dies a few years later. But at this point, you know, it's that fiery, passionate look on his face, even though he looks kind of grumpy. To me, it comes across as that man of determination and idealism, in which he's kind of conquered his political foes, but is still determined to do more. And he had aspirations toward presidency earlier on, and actually lost to James Madison. And so you have that rivalry between DeWitt Clinton and Madison, that New York versus Virginian. Uh, on a separate program, we'll go deeper into the Virginia conspiracy when it comes to the canal and building it. Then you obviously have George Washington here, as Mary points out, really fancy lacy jabot. He's and agreed these two portraits in person are much more impactful. And George, because of the way that painting is, really just it's vibrant, comes out almost off the canvas with his fatherly, stern kind of expression of, here's a republic, hopefully you can keep it, don't mess it up. Here we are a couple hundred years later. Let's see. So there's those two parts. I don't go too far into Washington. To me, everybody again is really familiar with this portrait or this image, and you can kind of see, he's again that straight mouth, still kind of that determined. And this, of course, painting after Washington's death. He's copied a few times. So they are. I mean, it's the founding fathers, in the sense of, obviously, you have Washington as the recognizable founding father of America. DeWitt Clinton very easily be called the founding father of New York as we know it, the Empire State. So these are two great images to kind of start this off, and a couple of wonderful images. And anytime anybody comes across an advertisement for my Who Wore It Better program, tune in or join us, because I'll go into an even deeper discussion about their similarities and differences, not just in images.
I think looking at these, as I have been for the past few minutes, I am struck by the fact that you have much more intensity coming from DeWitt Clinton's gaze. I feel like Ezra Ames, or whoever this artist was, if we're not 100% on that, he was sitting in front of DeWitt Clinton, and Gilbert Stuart was sitting in front of George Washington several years before this. And so I think the life in the eyes is less intense. It's a little more romanticized with the cheeks and the gaze, rather than the intensity that DeWitt Clinton kind of comes out of the painting. The artist's hand, one could say, is a little more skilled with Washington, but it has an element of nostalgia to it that I think we're going to see throughout these paintings. There's the hint of nostalgia all along in the Erie Canal. So we'll move forward here. Maybe. There we go. So this painting is just wonderful. By the way, all of these images, I believe all of them except George Washington, is currently on view at the Arkell Museum. And DeWitt Clinton is not. He is safely tucked away in collections storage. But you can see Washington. The rest of these paintings are on view at the State Museum, which I don't believe is open yet again, but they have a big Erie Canal exhibition. So that's always something you can go and check out. This painting is a folk painting. Folk art, if you're not familiar, what folk art is art done by people who were not trained professionally. It doesn't mean they couldn't do the art that they do. A lot of times folk art is more art for and from the people in a way. It's less stuck on what is art and what is convention and all of these things. It's more fluid. It's a little more fun sometimes. And this painting seems a little rough. When you look at it, it has been reworked several times, meaning that the artist has gone over it and changed things. But we'll look a little bit closer at some of these images, and David can talk a little bit more about them as we get into them a little bit more, because I had fun with Photoshop cutting and zooming in on this. I think this image actually gives us, let's go back. the life of the Erie Canal. This was painted by an artist that we only know by the signature on the painting. So that's S. Georges. We know they were active in 1856 because that's the date of the painting. Who that person is, we're not really sure. We have not found anything else. If you have an S. Georges stuck in your attic or something, let us know. We're always interested in finding out more about our painters. But this is clearly someone who probably lived or was traveling through. There's been some, what's it called? Guesswork. That's the best word I've got right now for that, about who. Was it a man or a woman who painted this? And as we go forward, I'll say why, when I was reading about it, why it was guessed it's probably a male. David, do you want to say anything right here, or should I go to the next image?
No, I just was going to put out that I found this to be a really great, really interesting, sort of that romantic kind of reality of canal during this enlargement phase, the second phase of the canal. And I also, I don't know if you'll speak to the bridge a little bit, but I just want to mention that the bridge, to me, it seems pretty impressive, and the abutments they're kind of high, so they don't really kind of represent a lot of what we speak of at canal sites about low bridge or a farm bridge. I'm not going to sing the song, but I think everybody knows the low bridge, everybody down. So it doesn't really look like a Whipple bridge or a Squire Whipple bridge, but it may more likely be a pony truss covered bridge. It does look like it's higher. Those are also used on a few of the other lateral canals that would last, upwards of 50 years in its bridge design, as opposed to the 10 or 15 years farm bridge. So that's one of those things that kind of drew me out. The fact that the abutments are quite large, and it's a much more stylized bridge. It could just be part of the painter's interpretation of the bridge and their style, but they're painting this of an actual scene on the canal that looks like more the pony truss style bridge. And I also will point out and I don't know if you have a zoomed in version of the barge, the boat that's on here, looks less like a typical canal boat, whether that be a line or cargo boat, and a little bit more almost like a converted Durham or a ski boat. It looks a little bit more like there's a ruddered system on the back of something that otherwise less what we typically view as, particularly in the enlargement era, mid 1800s version of the canal. So I thought that was kind of an interesting view of the boat. Not to say that there weren't all sorts of boats, packet, line, cargo, and some other boats that are on there as well. And I do also find that these the gates coming into it are kind of interesting. Almost kind of looks like it might be part of a lock gate as part of a juncta or intersection. It might be part of a feeder that provides water into it. So without more information so far as where it is, if it's just titled as Erie Canal 1856, it might be kind of difficult to identify just what that is. So far as the angle of those, that what appears to be a single gate or even a double gate entering into the canal at that angle. So those are a couple of the notes that I had on there. And obviously to interestingly note the team of draft animal and the stable, and that kind of harkens to me that concept of the enlarged era version of the canal, in which there were stables along the way. A lot of the barges companies, the transportation company would have stables along the way, instead of having the horses or mules on the boat when they're not towing it. They would be stabled off at regular intervals. So that's kind of the short commentary that I had to start on this image. So if you want to speak a little bit more from your end, Mary.
Sure. The kind of guesswork that's been done on this painting suggests that when it was purchased, they were thinking, oh, it's definitely Canajoharie, but everyone looked at it and said, no, there's no way it's Canajoharie. It's just the hills and things are not correct. So the idea is it might be Little Falls, but it is missing a lock that would have been found in the background. So again, we're a little unsure exactly where this was, but we do know it was the Erie Canal, so that's good. We're in the right canal. Just a couple things about this painting that I really enjoy. I find that figure in the front in red. Red is a great color to look for in art. If you are not an art person, red is a color that artists use to draw your eye to certain things. So in the foreground, we have this gentleman, I believe he's fishing. He looks like he's wearing a ball cap from like our world today. He looks like he could be your grandfather fishing there. It's kind of funny. But he's in the foreground. His gaze leads us up to that kind of funny boat that's not a canal barge that David was speaking to, and then to the red, up to the red, the writer in red, highlighting there that the horses or the mules being changed over, that is a central part of what's happening in this. If we didn't have those animals moving that boat along, we're not going anywhere. And I think that's a great touch. Also, the red building in the back, that red brown, it might have been a different color. We might have some color change happening with the pigment, but it's a nice line to kind of get us focused on what's important to the artist in this painting. Going into highlights here, there's our fun grandpa in the front with his great hat, and lots of various different types of boats here on the side, kind of sketched out, showing that we've got a lot of different things happening on the canal. We get this one view of history that it was barges, they were pulled by mules, and that's it. And I even asked David, because one of our images coming up has horses. I was like, wait, isn't the song about mules? Like, wasn't that it? And it really shows that this was a working waterway. It wasn't just one type of transportation, just like you would see today on the thruway that goes through the Mohawk Valley. It's my little tiny car, but it's also semis, and it's also, mom vans and things like that. So the variation gives this painting a lot of life. Some more fun life in this painting are the figures. What we have down in this boat is really, really interesting. One of the things I was reading calls this guy here, I think you can see my cursor, in Dutch garb. I'm not really sure if that's necessarily accurate. I don't know what Dutch people were wearing at that time, but it might be. In the center of the boat, interestingly, and this is because we just don't have a lot of images of African-American people, we've got an African-American fiddling in the center of the boat. And up in front is a woman, possibly a girl. She's got a very pronounced dress on. You can see that it's got the low shoulder, it's basically an upside down triangle. And the low shoulder dress that fits with the era. Kind of strange to see, on this, sorry, I'm reading comments at the same time. Shouldn't do that. It definitely speaks to the era, and maybe she would have had something over her shoulder. We've got laundry out in front drying. What a great detail. That kind of specific thing makes this much more real to all of us. How did you do your laundry? Well, you did it like that. And that's a great little piece in there. Again, with folk art, you've got some fun things with size, not a classically trained artist may not do scale all that well. So very large horse behind a boat that's much smaller doesn't work with the perspective. But you also have a great little ghost child. I'm assuming it's a young boy. It's Halloween time, so I have to comment on the fact it kind of looks like a ghost there by the cart. But I love that guy, kids right by the water. It's something that we as people in 2020, oh my, this is all right by the water. It's kind of intimidating to us. Lastly, I'll point out my favorite figure. Oh, I did get closer. Look at that. We've got our lady there with her shoulder showing. So we have a gentleman to the right of the barn that has the horse coming out with the gentleman in white and the white tailcoat. We have a gentleman urinating into the side of the, canal. When I was reading up on this, it was, said, well, we don't know if it's a male or female artist. And one of the comments was, well, a woman would never paint a man peeing like that. And I was like, I didn't want to say, well, that's not true, but at the same time, it very well possibly could be true. So we've got a lovely gentleman there. So again, that liveliness, that real life kind of vibe that we have with this painting makes it very charming, even though it's not Gilbert Stuart's hand of excellent painting. There's much more life and interest in here with the folk art. So let's go forward. Oh, and here it is. The painting that helped me understand the Erie Canal. I grew up in Arizona. There's no water there. And so one of the things that when I came into the Mohawk Valley, I had learned about the Erie Canal. It was a big canal. Like, it was important. Even in Arizona, we learned this. And what was interesting about this, what I loved about this is we have this painting blown up and actually as a wall mural at the Arkell. And when I first saw it, I was like, oh, now I get it. The old Erie Canal was next to the river. Like, my mind could not understand where it was because it's very hard to see the Erie Canal unless you go to Schoharie Crossing. You're not finding the old pieces of the canal. You're finding the Canalway Trail or something like that, and the locks are in the river. So this really helps us orient to what it would have been like with that earlier canal. This is an 1862 oil painting by William Coventry Wall. He was a painter out of Pittsburgh, and he did a lot of landscapes that look a lot like this. He's most famous for paintings of the fire that occurred in Pittsburgh. At one point, he was there, and he painted two views of it that are important to the history of Pittsburgh. And other than that, he's not well known. He's not your most famous, artist, but he's painted something I think really helpful for me, but also just it's a beautiful view of the Mohawk Valley. It's got to be near the noses. And it's very idyllic. This is compared to our last image where there's a gentleman peeing off the side of the canal. There's a lovely woman walking in the front of the painting, and it is idealized, and that liveliness and life is there, but in a much more pastoral way. David, I'll throw it to you here.
Yeah, no, I think you make a extremely valid point when it comes to the understanding of the canal today, and how a lot of people will view it's a disconnect between, particularly in the eastern section. Obviously, in the Mohawk Valley, we have that difference of a canalized Mohawk River. So there is a disconnect to the historic canalway. There's a few bits and pieces of it here and there you can see. There's obviously some of the remnants at places like Schoharie Crossing, toward Waterford and Fisher's Ferry. There's a few spots where you can see that in the Capital Region area and parts of the Mohawk Valley going out toward Little Falls and beyond. But often the view of the canal today is disjointed in that way. You don't see it as the same system or network that it once was, and that's because it's the canalized Mohawk River now, and there's different modes of transportation overlapping in that area between the New York State Thruway, created in the 50s, and routes 5, 5S kind of bring a lot more traffic through the corridor, and the train lines that had gone through. One of the things I like about this image is to me, the apparent lack of road here, even though it's an 1862 oil on canvas painting. And I made some notes here while I was looking at this image, trying to come up with a few things to talk about, and you've mentioned those. But I also want to point out, it's that majestic beauty of the Mohawk River Valley. It allowed for the success of the Erie Canal and also revolutionary transportation transformation in the transportation, the economics, politics, society, everything, even engineering in early America, all kind of in this little corridor. And you make a good point of that appears to be the noses. That's that narrowest gap in the mountain chain that allowed the canal to go through, and the geological advantage that New York State had through the Mohawk Valley to be able to accomplish that. So when we look at that ancient valley and we're looking across toward the nose that creates that east to west split, it's really something to kind of hold and to see that beauty of how something as simple yet complex as a natural waterway can help inspire an artificial waterway, and man's ability to kind of use of the topography and kind of claim its own sense. It kind of it's kind of it's a nice resounding interior within yourself when you go through that area. If you drive through it and you make that connection to the history and the space when you're driving through it, to me, you can't help but kind of feel that inside as almost another level. And you can see that in this painting almost. And one of the things that I find interesting about it too is that date. So that sensation that it gives me by looking at this painting and knowing that space and driving through it and having the understanding of the canal and the artificial river of the canal and the natural river of the Mohawk River, is that it's 1862 is when this was painted by Wall. And at that point in time in American history, the nation is embroiled in the Civil War. So it's a very idealized landscape that's bringing some form of beauty amid the conflict and division that's going on within the nation. So you have a waterway that brought unity, this bond of union, not only to New York State, create the Empire State, but also east to west, sort of as George Washington, harkening back to our early part in this presentation, George Washington had traveled after the Revolution and had commented about bringing together the interior of the continent toward the Great Lakes with the eastern seaboard and how that would create that bond of union. That's what the canal did. So as the nation is split amongst the north-south division, you have this great representation of the east-west connection of the canalway. So while the canal itself changed the development of America, and it created that larger north-south divide that also allowed for the expansion and settlement of the west. But it quickly leads to the rapid industrialization in the north, northeast, and across into the Great Lakes. It helps spur the agriculture in the Midwest and encourage the machine of cotton, even in the South, for the textile mills of the North and in a global market. So you have a lot of that, obviously in this beautiful landscape painting. If you digest it into the context of when it was being created and what it represents, to me, that's, again, traveling through that space, I can feel it inside, knowing the history and the natural beauty of the space. But I think taking it to that next level and applying a larger view of New York history as well as national history at that moment in time.
Yeah, I think too, it's that I hadn't put together, I should have, that 1862 date. That even gives you more of a feeling of the nostalgia here. It's definitely much more nostalgic. It already seems that when you look at it, it's trying to give you harken back to a past of safety, one that had quality technology to allow this, but one that is safe. This is a safe image, and that must have been meaningful in a time of such upheaval. Oh yes, Sue, thank you. Bucolic, or I might be pronouncing that wrong. One of those words you read a lot but don't actually say out loud. I'm going to switch to our next painting, hopefully. There we go. This is just a gem. It just makes me happy when I look at it. This is A. Wadsworth Thompson's Life on the Towpath, 1881. And this image is interesting. Trying to find and make sure that I'm correct in what I'm about to say, because I'm questioning myself all of a sudden. But this image is wonderful. It is, compared to our first painting by S. Georges, you can see again the quality of the artist's hand, much more highly trained artist here who understands perspective a little bit better, but is still playing with the same ideas that that we get in S. George, that drawing the eye up to from near where the gentleman's hands are behind the horses, that bar he's holding, which I'm sure has a name. I'm sorry, farm people who understand farming things, is red. The horse's collar has red in it. And then we go right on back to the barn and what is happening in the background, which is really the main event in the painting, even though the horses are in the foreground. I mean, those horses are working. It looks like they're just ambling along, enjoying themselves. But then when you look, you can actually see the line coming from the team all the way to the barge in the background. And it really shows that these animals are working as powerful work. I also love the detail of the ducks scrambling out of the way, like that, hearkening to that idyllic look at the canal. We're in 1881 here. I'm pretty sure this painting was part of actually kind of an important event. Why am I questioning myself? In the 1880s, William J. Arkell became friends with an artist named Edward Gay, and we'll see one of his paintings, I believe, coming up. And this friendship blossomed, and he supported this organization that had been created called the Artist Mutual Aid Society. And the Artist Mutual Aid Society started in the 1860s when a kind of famous painter passed away. His name was William Rainey. And when he passed, his widow was left with nothing. I mean, there are not social protections at this time for widows. So facing a mortgage and debt and things like that, artist friends gathered together and put on an exhibition of this artist's work and others, and the proceeds went to benefit the widow. They made quite a bit of money for the time, worked really well. So the Artist Mutual Aid Society grew from there. And in the 1880s, in 1880, Edward Gay and William J. Arkell at this point, this is not Beechnut's founding CEO, Bartlett Arkell. This is, I believe, his brother, William, and he's in New York City. He is working in publishing, and he gets involved with this person, this artist, Edward Gay, and he says, well, I've got an idea. Let's have an artist excursion. We'll go down the Erie Canal all the way from Albany to Buffalo, and you guys can get out and paint, and, you know, it'll really sell the Erie Canal, because I'm sure David can talk a little bit more about this. We have the Erie Canal is being much more supplanted by this point by rail. It's starting to be, you know, will eventually in the next 30, 40 years, cars will come in, but the Erie Canal is not being used as much, but we still have this gorgeous, beautiful landscape that it travels through. And not to waste that, Arkell says, well, let's have an excursion. And they actually take two barges and they pack it with artists, something like 20 of them all go together, and they have stops planned, special lunches. They do a clam bake at the Arkell home in Canajoharie. There's lots of stops, and they're kind of picked out. They're kind of like, oh yes, this is perfect. This is the image the artists are going to want to paint. And from that, there was actually an exposition of these paintings. Some of them were gifted back to the Arkells as a thank you for paying for and planning this event. One of the funniest things in there was a comment. We have diaries from these artists writing about these excursions and, you know, what they saw and thought and all these things. And one of them just comments on another artist and how he didn't like anything. Like, he just didn't paint, he didn't draw, he didn't sketch the whole time. He just floated on looking grumpy the whole time. And the artist says, you know, they were traveling together, and the grumpy artist points out a weather vane, and he's like, oh, that's nice. And that was the only like positive thing this artist said the entire trip. So he must have been fun to travel with. But life on the towpath comes from this excursion. It is idyllic. It is giving you that. Why do you want to visit? Well, you want to visit because it looks so beautiful. It looks like this, and it's a travel poster in a way. And the idea being these artists are going to go back and they're going to tell their art friends, and this word is going to spread to publications and things. So this is like a nice, like, they've always been traveling along the Erie Canal, and this just hits right in that whole thing. David, I can throw it to you if you want to talk a little bit more about it.
Yeah, I think that you use the term idyllic, I believe. This is very iconic as well when it comes to this image. I mean, you have the mule driver, the horse driver here. Perhaps it's a boy. Sometimes those boys were between 8 and 14 or so, and they would work on the canal with their families and stuff. But as your eye is drawn up toward that lock, I also want to point, particularly for the local people, and we're going to just kind of talk about that lock. It might have been very much kind of
Yeah.
what Lock 33 would have looked like. So if you're in the St. Johnsville area, you can check out the enlarged remains there at a park in St. Johnsville. You can kind of see as your eyes drawn toward it that barge is being pulled out of its position. It probably just probably headed east, so it locked down as it's making its journey toward Albany. And I'll just point out this looks much more like it would be a line boat, potentially having some cargo and some passenger space. Most likely mostly freight at that point in time, though. The original canal was 3 types of barges. You have packet, which carried passengers; line, that carried passengers and cargo; freighters or cargo, they only carried obviously freight or cargo. And Mary points out too that by this point in the 1880s, most of the traffic on the canal is freight, and it's being hauled by transportation companies who are heavily in conflict with, or they are in some sort of competition with the ever increasing railroads. But in the 1880s, I do want to point out that in the 1880s was sort of the high water mark so far as tonnage on 1888. There's 400 million tons in a season being transported on the canal. Does drastically drop off after the 1880s, during the 1890s with an improvement plan, the $9 million plan that kind of doesn't really help with the resurgence of the canal system. But eventually, underneath the governorship of Teddy Roosevelt, New York State does create what's known as the Barge Canal. So these kind of iconic scenes, particularly in the Mohawk Valley, disappear as the Mohawk River is canalized by those giant locks that you can see on the system today. We had the movable dams, those kind of bridges to nowhere that you can see as well. So Mary made some great observations so far as travel on the canal and kind of what you can experience from this image. There's a potential that there's that barn-like structure, that red barn or shed, that white building. There's a good chance that is, and that's kind of why I make the reference to Lock 33 or in St. Johnsville, perhaps towards Breakers, places in the Mohawk Valley. Even it doesn't look just like something like Brown Castor that would have been in Fort Hunter. But there's a potential that if that's a family dwelling, or maybe it's a canal store. It could be something very well attached because it's on the towpath side. Those people were probably creating some sort of cottage industry or canal store to appeal to the canalers along the way. So they could have been, some of the cargo on that boat could be headed out. It could be raw goods headed to Albany, down in New York, out to kind of that global market as well. And I'm gonna chance this right now. I'm gonna go ahead and call out. We have somebody that's on. Bill, if you're listening, I challenge the Canal Corporation to have an artist excursion on the canal sometime in the next few years. It would be great to get into that. Very much as Mary described, these people traveling on the canal, creating art along the way. Hopefully, you can avoid having the grumpy guy and the windmill incident. But I think there's a lot of beauty along the canal today that could be very well represented and kind of create those traveling posters of today. Let's say I know the Canal Corridor, the Canal National Heritage Corridor, has the photo contest. There's a lot of iconic images of today's canal that could be painted or otherwise demonstrated by artists in a very similar fashion. So I think that would be a fantastic way for the canal of today to kind of advertise itself, to make the connection to the history that's that's kind of represented in this image to the historic young canal, the 100-year-old canal that's on the National Register, one that's in operation today.
I do, there's, excuse me, Woo. About 75 paintings came out of this artist excursion. So it was also very an opportunity for these artists. As Sue pointed out in the comments, they even had a band on board. It was quite the to-do. It was a very fun, excursion. So when you're planning the next one, obviously a band needs to be involved. No pressure. So, you know, a couple of these paintings will be coming up. There's a couple of them in the collection that were a part of this excursion. One last thing to point out, which I didn't even notice when I first glanced at this image, but I absolutely love this woman on the towpath walking. She's literally 3 blobs of color, but you know it's a woman. She has a dress on, some sort of a shawl, and an umbrella. And it doesn't take much for a good artist to give you a very quality idea, just a few brush strokes right there. And I also love that it harkens to what the canalway is now, which is recreational for a lot of it. You know, we have the Erie Canalway Challenge being an example. Clearly, we are not the first to walk along these paths for recreation. So I like that image of the woman in the background as well.
Mary, I think that's a great point too. You're making too, because the towpath, it's represented here, and it's great. You have those draft animals, and it's sort of that working image. But the artist, obviously, as you mentioned, has this this woman walking along as well. And it's another good example too. I'll point out that the canal wasn't just cargo and you know, it's ideas and it's people moving along that way. The towpath all across New York State went essentially a state road. So you have draft animals and the barges being pulled, but that towpath is so well maintained across New York State that you have a lot of people just from community to community either using the towpath or the opposite side, that berm, which was the heel path, as a means to convey themselves either in a carriage or by walking. It was a great way to connect communities along the way, and I think that that's something that we see today with the Canalway Trail or a lot of the other parts in the Heritage Corridor. That you know, it's a connection to each other that we all kind of share as New Yorkers. And there's the comment coming in that I'll read: "You'll always know your neighbor," and that's one of those things that, you know, as you point out, the artist, simple little bit of paint, and you get the idea that it's that woman that's walking, and it's really nicely conveyed. And to me, I can extrapolate that out as to a much bigger idea about how the canal connected us with our commerce, but it was all a way to connect communities.
All right, let's go to the next image here. This is when you get to talk about all of that, David. This was another image done during the artist excursion by David Maitland Armstrong. This is great. He had a diary he kept, so we actually have some of his thoughts on the painting and on the trip itself, which is a lot of fun. And the details here are great. We know he did this from sketches. He misremembers exactly what he put in the painting in his diary, which is kind of funny. He's like, "Oh, I put a team of horses that reminded me of this," and it's like, well, no, there's one horse. Sorry. But I always think it's funny in the historic record. How do you not remember exactly, or how is the date not 100% known? You know, me as a historian, that drives me crazy. And it's like, I understand now that that's just sometimes you don't remember things. I love, and I know David, you'll speak to this, but just how much is packed into all of the little bits and pieces of the image. It's a lovely little historic nod. We get to see what might have been there, or at least a little nostalgia in there as well, but a lot of fun. And and what you could get, what's important along the Erie Canal. We've got the plow right out front. We've got the horse. These are our main things that we're seeing, and the person creating, that nice triangle there in the center for us. He draws our eye everywhere with his red. He is really giving us quite the show with that color, but highlighting again, farm goods, textiles that aren't being made here. They're not being made in the Mohawk Valley. So hanging up there, showing that goods are moving through here, and it's not static. So I'll throw it to you again, David.
Yeah, to me, that's a canal story. It's got a little bit of everything in there. Although, and I don't really know the art background, and to me, it looks a little almost like as a non-artist or a not art history major, and just a history major. The building itself looks a little bit not canal way, if that makes sense. It looks kind of Mediterranean or southwestern almost in this image. A lot of the images that I recall having come across with canal stores, it's almost like, gosh, they almost look ramshackle. And there are some notes on canal stores as just kind of being like these mishmash of items in a not very pretty set. Essentially, there's a quote from Harper's Weekly that we have up at the Putnam Canal store on the east end of our site, Yankee Hill Lock, that kind of speaks to that as it sort of being a dreary kind of place. And when I talk to people about canal stores at the site, or I talk to school groups, um, much like this image represents, you've got a little bit of everything in there. It's sort of, I could talk about it being sort of like it's a Walmart and a Stewart's, or, the gas station convenience store, your haberdashery, bodega kind of situation that also has a bar, and it has a post office, and it's a one-stop shop for everything that you could possibly need as you're walking along the canal. So you don't have to leave the boundaries of the canal or far off the towpath. And on our site at Schoharie Crossing, within that short period of that short space of only 3 miles, there was at least 3 canal stores during the enlarged Erie Canal. There was also one previous to that on the original canal, in addition to one a little bit further down. So as you get into that mid-century version of the canal, the enlargement, just in that 3 space, you have 3 canal stores. You had Brown's Cash Store, Wemps Basin, and Putnam Canal Store, which very well could be selling any number of these sorts of things. You'd have a tack shop, particularly at Putnam. There was a cobbler and tack shop, so you could provide services for your draft animals, get your shoes repaired. Also at Wemps Basin, we have ledgers from that. So they're selling things even to the community or to canalers as well. Nails and shingles, oats, different kinds of food, just your common, necessities as well. What I like in this image too is that plow really is an agricultural nature along the canal. The agricultural societies that emerged during that expansion westward, and New York really kind of becomes known for its agricultural advancements, not just the agricultural products, but also developments in plows and farming techniques, and how that moves west with the people. So I made some notes on that as I was looking at this image. And again, the canal stores that would sell, and this looks like it really contains a lot of these things that you'd see typical canal store. They're probably selling those eggs from the chickens. They're selling stuff for horses, the oats and grains. They're going to sell everything from tobacco to those harnesses, fresh and canned produce. You're going to have meat. A lot of them had butcher shops, or were closely connected to butcher shops. There's clothing, nails, shingles. They offered postal services, and most of them sold alcohol and medicine, which didn't have the same kind of regulation. So most of the medicines of that era are heavy on their alcohol content with some herbs. But there's also some actual medicines being sold along the canal as well. But it was everything directed toward canalers to keep them close to their barges, quick, easy. But again, a lot of them also service the communities nearby, and that's where you would have larger establishments. Cohen's and Sprakers was a very large canal store on the way. Brown's Cash Store Fort Hunter. It did also serve the community of Fort Hunter, not just the canal. So I think that this does a really good job of kind of showing the amount of goods at a lock grocery or a canal store, and really kind of a beautiful, bright. To me, it looks a little bit more. I guess it's full with contents, but at least from the descriptions I've read of canal stores, much brighter, and almost more inviting than a lot of the descriptions I've read about canal stores.
I have a quote from actually the Canajoharie radii. Oh, if I'm pronouncing that wrong, my apologies. It says, at Yankee Hill Lock, just west of Amsterdam, stands an old country store. The boat was no sooner in the lock than all instantly jumped ashore, and in a moment, at least 16 artists were busily sketching the old house. So apparently, Maitland Armstrong might have been one of the artists that popped out and started sketching. But I agree, it doesn't read central New York to me. We've got a little bit of the broken down roof and, chimney, upper story, little broken down, but it does read very Mediterranean. So it's kind of interesting to see how different artists bring their own interpretation and their own memory to what they sketched. A lot of these are finished later. Although you can paint in plein air, as the quote says, they're jumping out of the boat and sketching. So, some of the details are going to be a little nostalgic. He might, I don't know, maybe Mr. Maitland or Maitland Armstrong is thinking of a whole nother place but needed to get a painting done. But this is still a nice painting because it shows something that was vibrant and important to the lifeblood of the Erie Canal and the people that frequented it, used it, lived near it. And so that's why I appreciate the painting. And I think, yeah. So let's go on to the next one. I think this might be our last image. Yes. This painting, this is like perfect for October. The Central New York was looking very much like this right now, so it's quite divine. We have this Walter Green image. This is from 1937. I was talking to David about this painting actually this morning when we were testing our audio, which clearly didn't help that much. But I love this image because you've got the car in the foreground, you've got your big steam engine in the center of the painting, and then in the background, you've got this thin little line and a little smokestack, and that's your barge. That's your thing traveling along the river or the canal. At this point, this is probably the noses as well. Everyone loves to paint the noses. But I was talking to David about this today, and I was like, oh, I finally kind of get it. It's like we've got right now, like the dominating force in the valley here in the 30s is this steam engine. That's the mode of transportation. But in the foreground, we have the car, and the car is becoming a very huge part of American culture in the 30s, and even onward post-war, it's going to be even better. And then you have in the background, you have the barge. So you have this, it's still there, it's still kind of happening, but this was the past. Our present is this train, and our future is going to be this car. Maybe that's me just happy nostalgia kind of thing here as well. But if you have, it's kind of a nice way to tell the story of transportation in the Erie Canal, and that's central to the story as much as the people. It very much is the transportation. Also, if any of you, and I'm sure you are knowledgeable car and train buffs, feel free to drop it in the chat if you know what make and model that car is, and if you happen to know what steam engine that is. We're always willing to learn new things about our paintings. So anyway, David, if you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, this is It's just a stunning Mohawk Valley painting, if you ask me, and very good choice for something this time of year here in October. Um, if you're in your automobile and you're driving through the noses and being able to see the color as it's hitting its peak in the Mohawk Valley now, you can kind of put yourself in the time and space of the 30s going through this now that you see the image. But you make some really good points about the layers of transportation here. I guess the only thing we're really missing is an airplane in the background. But you have the canal, you have the train, and the automobile. And I'd made a few notes while looking at this. Again, yeah, the 1930s, that was kind of like the emergence of kind of a car culture that's starting to, it'll really take off, as you pointed out, after World War II. But as the rail lines were dominating the valley for the transportation, that highway use was on the rise. And became much more affordable for families, for businesses to use them, and cargo eventually would wind up becoming more and more transported locally, and eventually, particularly in the 1950s, due to the Eisenhower interstate system, they're going to be across the country. Youth of the Teamsters unions with their tractor trailers and means of conveyance on roadways. So even the rail lines are going to kind of drop off so as their cargo. You have, again, a mention of the barge kind of tucked off there into the distance, almost like it's fleeting into the painting and almost fleeting into history at that point. That the Barge Canal, having gone in the Mohawk River and canalizing the Mohawk River, the system in the early 20th century, was intended to kind of transform yet again cargo transportation and kind of make New York State and the United States a little globally competitive. There's a lot of at that point. The Panama Canal opens, and there's a lot of internal improvements to the waterways of Canada. So New York and the United States are really looking to once again use the canal as a way to become more and more globally competitive for shipping, and never really realized that full potential for which it was really undertaken. You have in the 1950s, kind of, it starts petering off after World War II. A lot of the cargo that existed through the 50s and 60s being oil or gravel, some of these things that you can't transport via tractor trailers. Much today, a lot of the cargo that's being transported on the system today, because there is cargo, has actually risen in its tonnage in the last handful of years. There is still cargo, tends to be things like GE having shipped their large generators, Genesee breweries receiving their large fermentation tanks, large quantities of gravel and other raw materials that are just too heavy in that quantity to put on a railroad or too heavy to put on a tractor trailer. And it's much more cost efficient to ship those big bulk items through the canal on a mode of transportation that requires very little actual outsourced power to propel those barges. And it didn't live up to its potential as much as it had wanted from the early 20th century. And a lot of those railroad companies at that point in time, they succeeded decades before and had transcontinental railroad, and the increase and improvement of their systems, their schedules, the machinery, and how those rail lines really took advantage of the regulatory differences as well as the operational seasons. So the canal would operate only during warm months, May to November. Trains could run year round. Automobiles can run as long as the roads are maintained and the tracks are maintained. They can run year round. But the other part is when you have roadways and especially railroad lines are regulated differently by the U.S. Constitution. What's an interesting study is the difference in interstate and intrastate law when it comes to transportation of goods and regulatory of economic systems. So that's the Erie Canal fitting into that interesting niche in which it is entirely within the boundaries of New York State. So it qualifies as only being overseen by what the New York State Constitution would have to say about the regulation of commerce, even though it provides access to global markets, while you have things like the rail lines and automobile and the interstate system that connect different states having federal regulatory issues. And that kind of became apparent shortly before this during World War I, when a lot of the transportation systems were nationalized during World War I, even though New York State canal system was. And actually, the rail lines were handed back to their private companies before the canal was handed back to New York State. So those are a few of the commentaries. I'm not trying to, it's a beautiful painting, and I'm trying not to be overly negative about the situation in which the transportation kind of emerges and evolves as you move forward in the image from that background of the canal to the train and then the automobile. But geez, it's just, it's beautiful. And those trees and the way that you can kind of see the way that the sun is glowing on that ridge of the valley. You can almost feel the warmth in it. And if you've experienced autumn in the Mohawk Valley, you really understand what I'm getting at here, especially particularly on the south side of the river, as that sun really kind of comes up and over the ridge, or as it's setting as well. And again, if you're not from the Mohawk Valley and you haven't visited, it's definitely worth checking out, particularly in the fall for a sunrise and a sunset. So those are the notes I have in this image, and hopefully I didn't end it on a downer.
Yeah, I was thinking, oh, I could take this even more. We could talk about the environment and we don't need to go there, I guess, tonight. We can wrap it up before getting into all of that. I do like the little detail, and maybe this is because I live with a planner, but I think there's like a culvert behind the car there coming off
Yes.
of the that just like, I just love that little detail. It's just like, this artist was probably standing right there and was like, oh, I got to get that culvert in there just right. And so I really enjoy that little piece. Is wonderful. So
And what's great about
our
doing
last,
this is that we get these different perspectives. Like, I would have not noticed that, so I'm glad you pointed it out.
yeah, I'm interested a lot in as the Mohawk Valley, how does the environment and this long history of people living here, of transportation, of use, how has that affected the animals, the plants, and things like the culvert there? I'm like, oh, could animals go through it? This is where my thoughts are at the moment. So I think there's a lot of the environmental history as well that we could tug out of these images. But again, it's growing late, so we won't go there tonight. But I
It's just the
will end.
various layers that you have, particularly with canal history. You just in the paintings, but just the layers and layers you can digest this, and sometimes you just don't have the ability or the timeline to really get into all of it. But yeah, you can approach this from just about anywhere, and I'm glad you make that point. So
Um, Come on, computer. There we go. So I know David already told you what was up at his place. So I'm going to take a moment. My next chat, normally I do mine at 2 p.m. on Tuesdays. So we're going to be talking about Judge Magazine political cartoons. This was a publication actually run by the Arkells, and it was Republican. It was done in contrast to other publications that were political at the time. This is the end of the 19th century. So we're going to harken back to your knowledge of 11th grade history. We're going to use some terms like, free silver and free soil and all sorts of things that no one actually remembers, but we're going to remember them, and we're going to talk about how political cartoons kind of demonstrated the politics of the era and actually did a lot of nostalgia themselves, harkening back to historic events. Very interesting material, very colorful imagery, a lot of fun to see in person, which you can until the 30th of December, or in my talk on Tuesday. From there, the following week on Wednesday, I had my calendar up, but I'm on my phone now, so I don't know the date. We are having a special live stream event. Luckily, we are partnered with someone who can live stream on Facebook and YouTube at the same time. And we're actually having our Winslow Homer art collection put to music. The musicians are all from the Caroga Lake Artist group, and they have put together a musical, actually Grieg, and they're playing one of his pieces, and our art is going to be there, and the musicians are, and it should be pretty awesome. So that'll be at 6 p.m. The following Wednesday. And so check that out on our Facebook And other than that, definitely give us a follow. You can always tell your friends about us, which we always appreciate. Yes, Sue, Wednesday, October 28th. Thank you. That is when the Caroga Lake and Arkell Museum musical extravaganza, as I have called it, which is not the official title, is going to happen. So hopefully you all tune in for those things. And I will say thank you so much for hanging in with me. Sorry about the volume and all of those issues. So I will pass it back to David.
Great. Well, I've enjoyed this, and I hope that everyone that has tuned in has. Well, Mary, I appreciate you doing this program for us, being a part of this great conversation about the art and the collection of the Arkell. It's a fantastic museum, sort of right there off the thruway, and it has an amazing collection. And I kind of feel sad about the fact that it seemed to be as well known as it should be. It is a world-class museum in small Canajoharie. There's lots to do. Come out, check out the Arkell Museum. It's not that far from Schoharie Crossing. You can get a walk in at Schoharie Crossing, check out the art at the Arkell, grab some food in Canajoharie, maybe do a little bit of antiquing in Fort Plain and Canajoharie as well. Again, it's a world-class museum in the Mohawk Valley that is worth the drive. It is worth the effort to get there. And it's not that far from Schoharie Crossing, so you can hit up both of them in the same day. Check out our exhibit, check out the Arkell. Mary, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody at the Arkell.
David, this is
Thank
great.
you for those that have joined in.
Have a great evening, everyone.
And take care. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Pleasure is a shadow, wealth is vanity, and power a pageant. But knowledge is ecstatic in enjoyment, perennial in frame, unlimited in space, and indefinite in duration.